In the tunnels of life, we hold our breath, we close our eyes. Stiff as a bourne to the other side. We fill our lungs and we pray for light.
And what's going on, guys? Welcome to the Uncommon Line podcast. I'm excited today. We've got a special guest, Dr. Tania Glenn. We're down in Cedar Park, Texas. I'll bring her on shortly. An amazing episode. I don't want you to tune out necessarily if you aren't law enforcement or you're not a first responder or military, because same thing I say in every show, take something out of everything. And so I want you to at least take something out of today, because I think there's going to be something for everybody. But before we bring her on, I need to tell you a little bit about what we got coming up and our sponsors for today's show. So sponsors for today's show, first one, Soldier Socks. Thank you so much to Mike and Ellie for sponsoring the show. We've got some awesome stuff coming up with them. Just got off the phone with them the other day in regards to our project we have, which we're fixing to start with Operation Enduring Warrior. But make sure you go check out them. Use code THEUCL at soldiersocks.com. That's www.soldiersocks.com. It's SOLEDIER socks.com. And next, RX Plus Plates, the official sponsor of the Tactical Games, the official workout vest of the Uncommon Line podcast, unfortunately, because they kick your butt. Make sure you go check out their website at rxplusplates.com. Use code DUCL for a discount as well. Check out both of them, guys. Go support the Uncommon companies that we're involved with. We're really excited to be involved with them. So much stuff coming up. And on that note, just kind of give you a little bit of what we've got in the coming weeks before we bring on Dr. Glenn. We've got Destiny Rescue is going to be flying down to Dallas. We're going to sit down with one of their founders, investigators / undercover person, I guess, so to speak, what do you call it, Tom, with them, and have a really cool conversation with them on human trafficking across the globe and what they're doing to combat that. So really excited, guys. We got so much coming up in store. Mark's not here today, so it's a little bit weird. You're just stuck with me and Dr. Glenn, so I'm going to let her shine and kind of let her take the co-host seat on this. Really excited to have a conversation with her. And all I can say, guys, if you listen to the episode and this hits home with you, is reach out. That's all you got to do. Reach out. She's a resource. You've got resources. We're a resource. If you need us to put you in contact with somebody, please, all you have to do is reach out. You'd be surprised the amount of people that already reach out to us that we would never share. And these are the type of people like Dr. Glenn that we want to get you involved with. So without further ado, let's bring her on.
We feel our worlds caving in. We feel our worlds caving in. I will make it through this. Digging deep, sinking in. I'm done with everything holding me down. I will make it through this. There's a time to die and a way to live. I'm not going out like this, no. We are the light, we are the dream, we are everything.
And what's going on, guys? We are back. Thank you so much for joining us back on the show. As I said, we're here with Dr. Glenn in her, this is your headquarters, right?
It is.
You've got a couple different locations, which we'll talk about, but this is like HQ for you
This is ground zero.
here in Cedar Park, Texas. I try not to come down to Austin much, but when it's worth it when I do.
I don't either.
Yeah. So as y'all can see, I mean, you can't even see all the stuff that's on the wall. She came in here and one of the first things she's like, so we can film near the 5-finger death punch guitar. And I'm like, well, this is just awesome. So are you a music fan?
I am actually. So the best way I manage my stress is I work out every morning. And I grew up in the 80s. Like I was a child of the 80s, hard rock, heavy metal, glam metal, you name it. And so we actually, every piece of artwork on our wall has a story. That 5-finger death punch guitar, of course they have a whole CD about PTSD in the military called I've Got Your Six. And that was given to us by a Marine Corps chaplain. It's a signed guitar along with a signed CD. And so I'm like, yep, that's going in the waiting room.
Yeah,
it kind of sets the tone when you walk in here.
You've got some really cool stuff. I like this acoustic guitar up here too. Who's that from?
That was signed by Willie Nelson.
Oh, Willie.
Yeah. And then
That's
we've
awesome.
got Red Hot Chili Peppers right behind you. And that one is through the Corporal Chad Foundation, which pays for our veterans to get care for PTSD. And Chad, the son of the parents who do this foundation, his favorite band was Red Hot Chili Peppers. Yeah.
So for those that don't know, I mean, yes, like I told you, I don't want people that aren't in law enforcement or aren't a first responder or military to tune out and go, hey, this is just like, I think a lot of times people think that we're just this law enforcement podcast. Fact is, no matter what we're talking about, you can get lessons from. And I think this is something a lot of people struggle with, right? It's just very common.
Absolutely.
And in our realm of work. And on that note, like, give us a little bit of your background and how why so much to first responders and military? Like, how did you get started with just that genre, so to speak?
Yeah, so actually I knew I wanted to work in crisis intervention, and I was getting my master's degree at the University of Texas. And in my second year, my internship was at a level 2 trauma, was level 1 now, but back then it was level 2 trauma center, Brackenridge Hospital. And I was approaching the end. It was February of 93, and I just really didn't know what kind of therapy I really wanted to do, like what my passion was. And then I turned on the news on a Sunday afternoon and watched the ATF raid the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. And I knew that day my calling was to go help people like the ATF and to go to high velocity events. So it was immediate. Like I couldn't stand the fact that I couldn't go to that. And so I went to school the next day and I told my professors I was going to work with public safety and I was going to go to high velocity events like Waco. And they told me I was crazy. So
At UT.
At UT,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
And so here I am later, just as crazy as the rest of them, 29 years of just loving this amazing career. And I never look back.
Yeah, no, you've had, we've kind of know some, we won't say names, but we kind of know some individuals personally. And everybody just says she's a hoot. She's a hoot. She's fun. She's awesome, which a lot of people don't necessarily attribute doctors to being that way, and especially in this type of thing. But I think that mindset is why you're so successful at what you do. So on that note, I just want to jump straight into it.
Okay.
Our whole point of the show is changing, the culture, whatever that culture may be. If we're in an episode about firearms, the firearms come, first responders. This is a mental health crisis, right?
Right.
We are facing stuff today that people we've never faced before. And my thing to you, and one of the first questions I have for you, is this a crisis? Are we seeing a mental health crisis within law enforcement on the rise, within military on the rise, and quite frankly, in amongst the COVID culture right now in general?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now more than ever. I mean, there's no denying it. In the past year alone, 2020, the shit show that it was, you look at the level of trauma that our public safety folks have sustained through COVID and dealing with all of that, and then the riots and all of the violence and everything that's happened. Just the perception of law enforcement alone being so far off base in terms of what law enforcement really is and what they do and who they are. We're there, but we were there before, and so now it's just been like gas on the fire. So with the culture being the way it was, and I wrote a book about this, and I basically highlight the reason the culture change has been so slow in public safety is because back in like the 1950s, I mean, it was like you had state hospitals, and those were for the insane people who would walk around in circles and talk to themselves all day. So nobody wants to be like that. So then the stigma starts to break, and the society in general starts to accept mental health and get counseling, and it started to change over time. But what happened in public safety is that there were no good options, especially coming out of the 80s, early 90s, and then even into the 2000s. There were no good options for mental health care. You had all these therapists who, maybe a cop will go sit down, start talking about, I got shot twice, but we killed the guy. And the therapist is like, oh my gosh, that's horrible. And it's like, oh, never mind. And so there's nowhere to go. So there was this lag with public safety changing the culture because there were just so few therapists who wanted to do this work and who were savvy to the culture. And so here we are just in this deficit, and it's alarming and it's heartbreaking, and I can't stand it, which is why we work every day to do the work that we do.
Literally every day. Here we are on a Sunday afternoon, and I asked them, are y'all here on Sundays? And they're like, we have people that are working here on Sundays, and it's so true that we have to have that,
Absolutely.
Especially in today's thing. So, we talk about this crisis. So is this something that has always been present, or are we truly, okay, for example, let's use the suicide rates of law enforcement. It seems as if from the outside looking in, we're on this uptick, right?
Right.
Is this something that's always been an issue? and it's actually trending up, or it's not actually trending up, or is it actually trending up and it's just because of how we're documenting it now? Like, what are we attributing that to, where we're seeing more of this happen within law enforcement and the military?
I think it's always been an issue. I mean, the stats go, as far back as the early 90s in terms of twice as many law enforcement officers kill themselves than die in the line of duty. But it's trending up now. And I think what's happened is you all know, like, how when you run a call and it's a suicide, and you start to learn like the family dynamics, and the uncle killed himself, and, the father killed himself, and now the son's killed himself. And so it becomes this sort of family pandemic. And so in law enforcement, with the rates the way they are, it's become this sort of family pandemic, right? We look at how many officers consider killing themselves and how many follow through. And then the next town over has one, and the next town over, the next department over has one. And it's because what happens is it does in a way plant a seed that people start to consider. Now, in addition to that, my biggest thing is about the suicide epidemic is that you have to consider other things too. And everybody focuses on trauma. But what I really outline in the trauma and resilience class that I teach is that it's also, we're looking at the chemistry of the police officer, firefighter, paramedic, veteran. We're looking at your cortisol levels and how cortisol blasts through testosterone. And when that happens, you feel like crap all the time because you have no energy. We're looking at your vitamin D levels, because those of you on night shift, or your D levels are really, really funky low. And so that makes you feel like crap all the time. So we're looking at your chemistry. We're also looking at your sleep patterns. Because look at how many
what sleep?
What sleep, right? Right. Look how many officers wake up 7 times a night and clear their house, right? Or look at, we've got you on nights, but now you're going to a 40-hour CIT class, so we flip you to days, and then we flip you back to nights, and then we, and then maybe your shifts are rotating, and you've got all these sleep disruptions going on. And when you have bad chemistry and you tag on lack of sleep and poor sleep, and overtime, and, extra jobs and all this stuff, and having toddlers at home, it's this perfect storm of no sleep. And when you tag those two things together, your brain will tell you to kill yourself. It will convince you that there's no hope. You feel like crap all the time. And when you get to that point, it actually, your brain will convince you that everybody else is better off without you, which couldn't be further from the truth. And so then you throw on the traumas, you throw on the bad calls that you just can't shake, right? And you deal with the bureaucracy, and you deal with all the frustrations of all the things internally in the law enforcement world. And here we are. So I think that now more than ever, having the discussion about, we've got this and what are we going to do about it, is so important for leadership.
So is it a cop-out? Like, when I ask you that, I think you know exactly what I mean. I think we have officers that think like those are all excuses, and I'm sorry if I keep screwing this over. I'm going to move this real quick. We have officers that think, if you have that, or you suffer from that, or you go to therapy, that's a cop-out, or that you just have excuses like, what, you're weak, right? You're weak. Me personally, I think that makes you stronger than the person saying you're weak. Because you're able to admit something that they would never be able to admit, right? So is it a cop-out? Are they excuses?
Absolutely not. I think the officers who say it's a cop-out, I think either they're blessed with really great mental health and they just manage just fine, which some people do, right? Every class I teach, people are like, so Tanya, is it bad that I'm not impacted? And I'm like, no, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Rock on, right? But I think that a lot of folks who say it's a cop-out or you're weak or whatever, I think they're really ultimately just afraid to reach out, or afraid to have that conversation, or if they deviate from the it's a cop-out, you're weak line, then they might show some vulnerability. But I can't tell you how many officers have said, well, I think that's for sissies, but let me know how it goes. Well, wait a second. Let me know how it goes means like, did it work for you? Right? Exactly. Absolutely. And so we really need to not make that stigma part of getting help, because when it's a cop-out or you're weak or you can't handle it, the message is like, you don't belong in this family. You should get out. And that just, honestly, I have worked with so many people who have been through such significant trauma, who healed and then became better officers, firefighters, paramedics, because now they bring the wisdom. And the wisdom causes gray hair, and it's not pretty. It is not easy getting through trauma. But when you do, what happens is you're better with the public because you understand what they're going through. And you're better with other officers because you get what they're going through and you look out for them. And to me, like the people who get help are your honestly, they're your biggest assets. They're your biggest resources. They're some of the most valuable people you'll come across.
So you talk about the, people getting help and everything. And can you hear me, Jess? Am I coming through? Okay. Sorry. Anyway, sorry. We're in the office, so we have a little bit of echo, but we don't hear it. I don't hear it. It sounds good. So I lost my train of thought, but going back to, the need to get help and it not being a sign of weakness, throughout your career, have you seen these as trends, what departments are doing to make that accessible? And I mean, you travel a lot, work with a bunch of other agencies.
Right.
What are you seeing this trend of positive? Hey, we want to offer this to our officers. We don't think this is being a negative thing, or that officer is a negative fixture in our agency. What are you seeing, throughout your work?
Overall, I see us trending better. Overall, I think most leadership, especially these days, is starting to understand that if we don't take care of our people, we can't retain them. And I always point out, that seasoned officer that gets through PTSD is such a valuable resource. Replacing that person is impossible. Like, you have all these rookies that come out of the academy and they're struggling because they don't know the city. They don't know what they're doing. They're making terrible mistakes. And if you don't have your seasoned folks, then you got nothing. And I think that, that more and more departments are starting to trend towards, let's get help. Let's figure it out. The key is to not be sloppy about it. You get what you pay for. And if you want to just kind of slap a program in place that's like, just cheaply put together, you're going to get what you pay for. There are pockets of the country that are still very much suck it up. And that's unfortunate. And I hear from those public safety folks every day, about how, these systems are overloaded with horrible traumas and long histories and, and just a graveyard full of bad things that have happened that have never been addressed. And the leadership going, well, I just don't know what to tell you other than just get over it. And so overall we're trending better, but we've still got some challenges.
To me, I look at that as liability. When you have an administration that's willing to do that, like there's liability and risk with that, right?
Absolutely.
Like you're opening yourself up now to, I'm not just saying lawsuit, the loss of life.
Right.
And that's why I think to me, and I don't know enough about it to go, like, there's a lot to blame in leadership, right?
Right.
And organizational leadership, where we have this deficit of being okay, like for this to come in and work with you, right?
Absolutely.
Something I want to go back to, because I remember what I was talking about, or what I was thinking, is you said trauma. And so you keep using the word trauma. And I think for our line of work, are you saying trauma? Like, obviously a shooting, right? You're involved in a shooting, or you get shot, but what is trauma? Like, what are you defining trauma in, as far as like what you look at as a patient? Is it relative, or is it very specific what you think trauma is?
It's actually really relative. So what we look at is the person's interpretation of the event. So the trauma is the shooting, the trauma is the car wreck, the trauma is the events involving children. Those are kind of the top ones. Any sort of line of duty, serious injury or death, right? Those are the big ones. But it really kind of boils down to what sticks inside your brain. So what happens with trauma is each person has their own threshold beyond which they become overwhelmed. So you can, you've been on scene where you have two officers who, one will say, wow, this is crazy, this is terrible. And the other says, well, what's for lunch? I've seen 20 of these, whatever, Absolutely. And so what we do is we look at people's interpretation of the event, and their interpretations based on their history, their prior training, their successful resolution of previous events that are similar. And what we know is that with an event that your brain considers traumatic, what happens is immediately the physiology of your brain starts to change. It actually changes how it functions. So in a trauma, what you see, hear, taste, touch, and smell gets captured by your frontal lobe, which is right behind your forehead. And, you know, you all have been through gnarly, nasty calls where for the first few days you see, hear, smell, taste it, you know, and you replay it 1,000 times.
I still smell my first dead body and taste it.
See,
you know?
yeah. And because it was your first one, it made an impression, right? But what the key is that like 7 days post-incident, it's starting to fade and the smells kind of go away and the sights and, you know, all that stuff goes away. And by 14 days post-incident, it's basically banked in your long-term memory. You'll never forget it because it was significant, but it's not sitting here in your face. And here's what we tell all of our customers. If at 14 days, what you saw, heard, tasted, touched, and smelled is still here, you're replaying it, you smell it, you taste it, you're nightmaring about it, we want you to get help because that's your brain's way of saying, hey, this one is a little bit difficult for me to get past. And I give you guys 2 weeks because if you get help, anytime between the 2 and 6 week mark, it's all prevention. And we are all about prevention. Let's prevent as much as we can. And most first responders, once they have some other calls and some other distractions and they've slept a couple of times, those calls move, they fade. But when they don't, that's when I get worried, right? Besides the big obvious ones, when we get the smaller ones that you just can't shake, right? And we start to work through those and we start to get your brain to process them, you're at 100% prevention at that point, and it's amazing because we just get you past it. So we do a technique that actually gets the frontal lobe to process and download and push those images into your long-term memory. It's called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Sure.
Super, super effective. My favorite thing to do.
And so what is something, I'm just curious, like what does something like that look like?
So EMDR was developed in the early 90s by a lady named Francine Shapiro. And honestly, when I first heard about it, I'm like, no way. That is hocus pocus. That's like someone's way to make money. And I had a preceptor in the emergency room and she's like, you know, if you're going to go, treat PTSD in your career, you really need to go through this training. So I fly to Baltimore and I take the class. And during our first day of training is the day of the Oklahoma City bombing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So went upstairs in our hotels and watched it. We all watched it.
A lot went on when
yeah.
you were in school and training.
Oh my gosh, yes. And it was just perfect timing because 2 weeks later, the first person I did EMDR on after training, my first actual patient, was no kidding, an Oklahoma City firefighter.
Wow.
And he ran into what was left of the Murrah building and he found what was left of the daycare and he was not okay. Wow. And so I'm 26 years old and I'm having this conversation with him like, well, there's this brand new technique and here's what we think it does, but we're not quite sure because we haven't really studied it a lot. And he's like, Tanya, I'll do anything, which is very typical of people who are overwhelmed. And so I pulled up my chair and did EMDR on him and I watched this transformation. I followed him through his whole career because he was my first. He retired as a battalion chief a few years ago with 0 problems.
Wow.
So what the technique does is it replicates rapid eye movement that you do in your sleep cycle, which is when you process trauma from the last 48 hours, but you're awake and alert and in control. It's not hypnosis. I don't put you under a spell. So it's great for law enforcement because you have full situational awareness. And so what we do is we sit like we're meeting up. And I'll have you pull up the moment that just won't let you go, like that the most significant thing that is just rocking your world. And I'm going to have you pull it up and I'm going to have you focus on it. And what I do is we sit like we're doored up, okay? And so what I have you do is focus on my finger and I put a little light on my finger and I basically will take you bilateral left, right. So my hand is in front of your face doing this. I'm doing this. And what happens is what I'll tell you to do is when I start that first set, what I want you to do is just hold that moment in your mind. And when I start the first set, I want you to let your brain go where it needs to go. And your brain is going to process that call and it's going to process basically every bad call you've ever dealt with. And by process, what I mean is at the end of EMDR, when you're in your brain, the best analogy I can think of, it's like when you're on a long road trip and you kind of get that road haze and your mind just kind of wanders one thing to the next.
Have I been driving for the past 30 minutes?
Yes, exactly. And wow, look at where my brain went. Yeah. And that's what happens. And so as we're doing this, we're stimulating your frontal lobe to open the synapses and process and download. So at the end of EMDR, I'll have you go back to the original image that we started with. And everybody does this. First of all, they look up to their frontal lobe where it's been stored and they can't find it. And they're like, and then they start to like do the kind of like the 1,000-yard stare. And they'll be like, okay, if I think about it, I can pull it up, but it's like this fading, distant memory. And it is amazing. So you go home, you're tired when I'm done with you. I kick your butt, right? And then what happens is the triggers start to disappear and the nightmares go away. and people get their lives back. It's incredible, incredible.
So let me ask you this then. So let's say let's say somebody's struggling with not necessarily a trauma, right? And I don't want to, because to somebody that may be trauma, to other people it may not, right? So let's just say it's just, bad home life, right? Or, off-duty stuff, that we wouldn't necessarily let's call it trauma, a shooting, or you've been shot, or a bad call or something like that. Do you use the same techniques to help people get over that? And do you see, are your patients also that you're dealing with, and are you seeing people that equally have as much trouble outside of work than they are inside? And do you think there's a correlation of what's happening over here outside that they then bring it into the job that then causes the job and trauma to happen?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we use EMDR for trauma. We use it for anxiety. Sometimes we use it for, any sort of thing where we feel like it's going to be effective. Yes. With the off-duty stuff and the family stuff, what we really do is we like to tie in whatever modality is going to work. So sometimes it's cognitive behavioral therapy. Sometimes we ask you to look at how you perceive things and to challenge some of your perceptions and then change your behaviors, right? So we give a lot of homework here, but first responders love homework because they like progress. Yeah. And sometimes we involve the family members, of course, if it's family issues and those kinds of things. Whatever the patient needs, we use the proper modality to treat that. And so sometimes we're coming at it from several different sort of prongs. Like we've got couples therapy going on. We've got EMDR going on for both of them, right? We've got some cognitive behavioral stuff going on to work through that. We're working on burnout. We're working all of our patients. Their homework initially is to work on their resilience. And we start with hydration, nutrition, rest, and exercise. And then your family, your faith, your friends, your hobbies, your life outside the job. And so all of that is simultaneously going on. So we hit it from every direction we can to really get some good progress going and get some good stabilization going. That's how we do it.
So on that note then, I know Mark would have wanted to ask this question, but just, the aspect that COVID just, excuse the language, like fucked everything up royally, right? I would imagine it's taken a toll on, luckily you said y'all were an essential business, so you were able to keep rocking and rolling. But do you still feel like it had a direct impact in all of your patients and negative or positive?
Yeah, COVID has been a complete ass kicker. It's been so rough. Our paramedics and firefighters like sleeping in their garages at the beginning, just wow. so like concerned about that. I think that, a lot of people have had COVID, a lot of officers, a lot of firefighters, paramedics have had it. The quarantining of their families, all of that has just brought just tons and tons of stress on top of everything else. And, and then, for example, I worked an incident, I was brought onto a police department south of Austin after a really horrible incident where an officer was killed and 2 were shot. And that was in April of 20. And when I got down there, it's like COVID didn't even exist because they didn't even have the bandwidth to deal with COVID because they had so much trauma. And there was, it's like, and then, so when the department's like, really, we got to get focused on COVID, it was like one more thing to add on to that a month later. And so it's been rough. I will tell you, there was the 2 weeks to flatten the curve where everything just kind of died and the whole, I think country was stunned. And we were deemed essential and the county commissioners were like, please continue. So we continued to offer in-person services. And the only people who took us up on virtual, because everybody wanted to come in, the only people who did virtual sessions was like the paramedic with a fever. We're like, yeah, stay home.
Yeah, please.
Yes, please. Or like, I can't get childcare because there's no school. And so that was it. Everybody else has continued to come in. And Maggie from my team, she made a great analogy through this process. She said, it's like when you're on a flight and you hit some really tough turbulence and planes shaking around, everybody looks at the flight attendants and the flight attendants do the whole poker face like, oh yeah, this is normal. Yeah. Everything's fine. And she said, we've been like this poker face, like for our community, we've just been like, yes, we're open. Come on in. And, Yeah. And so we've basically just,
meanwhile, they're up in the, what is it? The area they talk at and, yeah. They're like the galley and they're like, how are we going to do this? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's like, what was that? And they're calling the captain like, are you kidding me?
Yeah. It's interesting to see how this has affected everything, right? It's not just mental health, and I mean, just everything, you know,
Yeah.
and how many people have had to overcome this. And so did y'all have to change how you, I mean, I take it you kept the same, did you have to change how you were treating people and your approaches because of it?
So we did a little bit. I mean, we had the social distancing, the masks. We have made the masks optional in therapy. Once you're in the therapy room, it's up to you. You can take it off. You can leave it on. Most people have taken it off. We have asked them, "Are you comfortable if I have no mask on?" That kind of thing. EMDR. We've just we've made sure that you haven't had any symptoms in the last couple of weeks, and because you have to pull up close next to you. So we've done that, but we've actually been I don't know. We've just been adults about it.
Yeah. How it should be.
Yeah,
really.
exactly.
How it really should be.
Exactly.
So I want to go back talking about now that we've kind of set the tone in regards to, the stigma and go back and visit the stigma, so to speak. Give you a situation. You've got let's say in these agencies that you're talking about where they don't, it's just suck it up, get over it, right? There's this ideology, and I know because I've been there and seen officers and talked to officers that I don't want to get the help because I'm going to be looked at differently, right? And the same thing with the military people. I don't want to get the help because I don't want to look as weak. We're supposed to be these warriors, these people that, and we look back at this, and a lot of times there's this thought of weakness, right? And I'll be honest, I've been guilty of that. Like, not now being educated, it's like, no, in fact, I think opposite. I think you're a stronger person, and I think the person who's saying that is completely weak. But what is your message, not to officers, but you're sitting here with the police chief, I'm not a police chief, but you're sitting here and they're talking to you about this, like, and they go, well, we don't have this going on, or, this isn't an issue, or, hey, well, that person, we're going to take him off the streets because what do we think? If you need help, you take his gun and get him off the streets and everything like that. That happens. We see that happen.
Yeah.
I've seen it happen with officers when all they needed was help, right? Like, what is your message to that leader? And really, I call them managers because I don't think a leader makes that decision. I think a manager makes that decision because they look at that as a number. A leader says, how can I help my people?
Right.
So what do you say to that manager?
So okay, 29 years of doing this. It has been very, very rare. Like probably 5 times we've needed to put people on FMLA, pull them off the streets. But usually it's so obvious that they want to be off the streets. They don't want to be at work, right? Because it's just, whether it's, severe substance abuse or severe PTSD or whatever it is. But the majority, that vast, vast, vast majority of officers who get help come in, they never miss a beat. Their performance is fine. There's absolutely zero reason to question them, to evaluate them, to pull them off the street, to change anything about their duty. And they end up more resilient and better off. So for anybody who is going to give lip service to mental health and then pull officers, pull their weapons, pull their badges, pull them off the streets, you're sending the message to the rest of your troops that you can never ask for help. So don't give it lip service, like get in there and mean it. And what you do is maybe you as a chief, you go to counseling yourself and you see what it's like. And you see that people perform their duties day in and day out simultaneously to being in therapy or in counseling all the time.
So why is this even if you've only seen it a few times, you've got a lengthy career. That number, seems low to me, and this is me not having the knowledge, right? But like, why is it still the stigma?
Yeah.
If there's things that are being implemented, if there's programs out there, and this is now being spoken about in the media and everything, but yet there's still a stigma. Like where is that rooted in?
I think honestly, it's got to be rooted in people's own personal biases. And whether it's carried forth through the generations of officers, or it's coming from your personal life and your personal, your home life, and maybe some stuff you've been through. I think that's where it continues. The fact that we're having so much success returning people to the streets or keeping them in fully on the line. I think that the stigma, whether it's perpetuated by leadership or it's perpetuated at the officer level, it's going to be perpetuated until you put together a program and you educate and you normalize. One of the things I do with all of my customers, and this is how I win sort of the trust of the chiefs. Let me treat your people. I will tell you if there's a problem. Like, I'll be the first to tell you, because, if you come to me and you are very, very dangerous, I see not only you as an officer, I see your entire shift that you're putting in danger. So we're going to have that conversation. But besides that, what I go in and do is I do education. My whole education piece, and I think this is where people get that I'm a little bit of a spitfire, is that I take
literally I've heard that analogy said before. Yeah, spitfire.
Yeah, I throw a lot of F-bombs every time I teach, but
good.
yeah, I love that. But I teach to the fight or flight response, and I take everything in terms of the fight or flight response, and I explain it and what it does to the brain and the body, and the adrenaline, glucose, and cortisol, and the impact on your health. And then I get into the 4 types of stress, and I take everything back to fight or flight. So I jokingly say that the F word is feelings. We don't use that word. We use the other one all the time, but not feelings, right? And so what I always do is I educate and I make it about the science and the chemistry of stress. And officers are like, and there it is. That's exactly every single slide. I have been through that, or I've had that experience. That was me, and I know what to do. But also the leadership sees that there's a plan in place. There's treatment techniques. There's a path ahead. And so that's how I think, especially with departments where I go in where there has been a stigma, I start to dismantle it. And I do it I teach through stories. I teach through I'm very, except for the family briefs, I'm very straight to the point and kind of in their face. And I tell the stories that everybody can connect to and really wrap their mind around. They can see where, I can see where that officer would need help, or I can see where, there's really no excuse not to give that person help. And so I try to do, I'm just very in your face, and I just try to do as much education and normalization to maybe help that stigma go away. The other thing I do is, I tell people all the time, whether it's in therapy or whether I'm training, is that you're a human being. You're not a sociopath, nor would you want to be. And you're not a robot, right? As much as you think you've got, nerves of steel and you're made of Kevlar, you're not. And so you're a human being. And the fact that calls bother you, they're supposed to bother you. Look at the stuff you guys deal with. Look at what you see. Look at the pain and the suffering and the bad things that you see happening to innocent people and children. You're supposed to be mad. You're supposed to be upset. You're supposed to go slam your trunk and jump in your car and, and drive down the road and
just completely pissed the fuck off.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to me, it's amazing that, and this is what blows my mind, and what we've seen in the last year of police reform or lack thereof, whatever some people would say, is that they don't see that we're humans, right?
Right.
It's I've been on calls where I've lost it before.
Absolutely.
And here's the difference. And I will gladly go to my supervisor and go, whoops, I fucked up.
Yeah.
I completely lost it. And to me, I think sometimes leadership may look at that red flag.
Right.
No. I mean, it's not a red flag. It's just a bad day. I was pissed off that the dad was hitting the little, baby, the 8-month-old kid, or putting the cigarette on the 8-month-old's forehead,
Yep.
How does that not, I mean, you're supposed to just be okay with that.
Right.
But I do think that there's this you hit the nail on the head, this robot, right? We think that at times we've got to be like that.
Right.
And even if you try to think about it differently, I've struggled with it. I've just got to go through the motions,
Yeah.
and my wife and I've had this conversation, and I've had the conversation with partners. Sometimes I'm more comfortable breaking down your front door. I feel more in the zone than I do, being in a grocery store.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm more nervous being in a grocery store, not for anything bad. Sometimes you just see that one dude and you're like, okay, and you look at that, and some people may look at that as wrong, right? And the public may look at that as wrong, and that we're not supposed to be like that. We're not supposed to have those feelings. And I really feel like, and I'll get into this, within our generation, and my generation, millennial generation, the idea of asking for help is non-existent. You can't.
Yeah.
I really feel that way, and I don't know what the remedy. That's why I keep going back to that. What is where is that coming from?
Yeah.
In 29 years, where is this coming from? There's got to be a root of why this is still in existence, when yet there's so much out there. And even in 10 years, 11 years of law enforcement, I've seen more resources out there.
You know,
Anyways, I get off on a tangent, but
I think that honestly, so back in 98 to 99, I took 6.5 months off my career and I went through the police academy here. And
you did?
I did.
You still hold your license?
No.
I was like, wait, what?
No.
It's like, I got to reach out to some people and find out. I didn't know this story.
It was a great experience. And honestly, it was, I cut off all my hair. I got the crap beat out of me every day. It was awesome. I was full of bruises. I broke my wrist during the academy, so I couldn't finish. Right. So that was kind of my segue back to my practice right at the very end. And I was arguing with the doctor about how I really didn't need a cast, but he's like, you're not going to go to the academy tomorrow and do push-ups, Tania. But I'll tell you, during that academy, someone came out and spoke about stress and stress management. And it was like this sort of like fluffy, flowery, non-science presentation. And I remember thinking, back then before rifles, we had a shotgun. And I was thinking, my weakness was shotgun, and because I didn't like it. And I was like, I could be out there shooting shotgun right now instead of listening to this bullshit. Right. And so, but that's part of it. Like if it starts there, right. And then somewhere along the line, somehow the message gets transmitted that you're supposed to be a robot, that, and of course on scene, you don't react emotionally because they teach you how not to do that, which is great because it keeps you from killing the parent who put the cigarette out on his, on his 2-year-old. But afterwards, guess what? Your brain immediately goes to your children or your grandchildren, or it goes to, just how horrible some people are and how much it pisses you off, as it should, right? And yes, absolutely. But somewhere along the way, the message is, don't have feelings. We don't do this. We don't talk about this. And if the message is there, then that creates the culture. And I will tell you that even in my most like supportive departments, but chief, get help. I've gotten help. Go get help. No names on the invoice. No repercussions. Nothing. You'll still have people who are like, I am so afraid to get help. Yeah. And it is very hard. And I know, I fully appreciate how hard it is to walk into this waiting room. Yeah. And I know that when people come in, especially the first time, they're nervous. They're really, and so I tell my team, if you have a new patient, like they walk in the door, get them back as quickly as possible, right? Have them fill out their intake packet in the therapy room, get them out of the waiting room. Because if there's ever a time someone's going to turn around and leave, it's because sitting here is very hard because you don't know what to expect.
No, it's like even being here, just doing a podcast, I'm like, oh God. I mean, I'm talking to like, sometimes I just want to yell at the camera's not being set up right. So I look over at my wife, oh no, Tanya's judging us right now. Because if I start like, I'm like, what's wrong with this one working? But to me, there's like that, to me, it's okay to have those feelings, I guess. But at the same time, I like want to overcome that for people.
Absolutely.
Because I think that we need to change that.
Right. And it's so significant that, so we have 3 suites that are all connected. On the other side of the wall that you're sitting in front of, that's our Leo waiting room. And so we have there's a code on the door. So for our Leos, especially in high publicity incidents and involved in shootings and those kinds of things, they have their own separate entrance. When I first looked at this place, I was like, oh, we'll just do a big arch and make it one waiting room. And then I was like, nope, and it's all blue over there. It is totally for them to have a space and a place to come in where they don't want to be seen. And when we explain that to them before they come, you can tell it helps a little bit, but it is tough. It is tough to ask for help. And people who are trained to be in control and maintain control and stay in control, they don't feel like they have control if they're asking for help. And so,
I think that's got to be a lot of it, just because we don't want to give up control.
Right.
Like, cause it's our scene.
Yeah.
It's my life,
I'm in charge.
Yeah. I'm in charge. Right. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, if you come down to it, your brain's in charge.
Absolutely.
And your brain's telling you all these red flags, and it's like, get this help.
Right.
So, something that was posted this last week, that it kind of stuck out, was this idea, and I won't bring up the death that just happened, but we were kind of talking about it last night at the house. Somebody that's supportive of law enforcement or in law enforcement, you have this substance abuse issue, and the people want to go get help. There's still this stigma that, you can't have a substance abuse problem and be a cop. After getting help, obviously you're not using drugs on duty and stuff like this. But I'm just curious, have you seen guys that have had substance abuse and then gone back to work?
Definitely. Absolutely. Yes. So, honestly, and I the majority of my patients, they come in with a substance abuse problem. And what I ask them to do is taper, because I know they're not going to go inpatient, and they're probably not even going to go like to an intensive outpatient. So I asked them to taper. I asked them to really, so there's some apps that have like support. There's apps that connect police officers to police officers anonymously. And so there's all these ways to do this. I've seen the majority of the people actually with substance abuse issues maintain duty while they taper, while they get sober, while they work on things. You guys are in control. You like to control things. And I'm like, well, can you taper? And it's like, well, I can do that. I had one officer and she was drinking 26 beers a night. Holy shit. Yeah. And I was like, holy crap. And I looked at her and I was like
she couldn't taper, right?
Well, no, but she did. And
She
so
did.
here's the thing. So she looked at me, she's like, what are you going to do? Stick me in a hospital? And I was like, no, not for a second, because in the hospital you end up going to because of her geographic location. I was like, there's going to be people you arrested. So no. And so I said, but could you taper? And she's like, what does taper mean? And I said, well, instead of 26 beers a night, because she was functioning, I said, this week, can you do 24? And she's like, Tanya, I can do that. And I said, okay, let's do that. So she went from 26 to 18 to 12 to quitting in a month. So those increments were each week down. And when she quit, I was so astonished. And I said, what made you didn't have to do it that fast, by the way. And she's like, no, once you give me like a task, I want to do it. And I said, what made you decide to taper that fast? And she looked at me and she said, it's because you never took my control away.
That's awesome.
Wow. Yeah.
That's awesome. And I have worked with people, and I know people that have had substance abuse problems.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, like, look, I'm not going to say it's right for you to show up to work drunk, right? Like, there's some lines here that,
Absolutely.
you can't be right. But at the same time, like, I think it's interesting when leadership doesn't want to, and I'm not going to say leadership's all bad. Like, I work for a great agency. I'm not talking about mine, but just stories I hear and things I've seen, experiences from past things, I've heard is, there's these red flags. You're getting the signal. We don't want to handle it, because I think sometimes they think, well, if we're admitting he's got the issue, then we're admitting we know he's gone to work with a substance abuse problem. So there's liability there. And then, we're just not going to worry about it. And then it blows up.
Right.
He kills himself or wrecks his car and kills another family. What are y'all doing as your organization to help the agencies identify those early on to where they don't even have to come to you, right?
Yep.
Like, what are the, you see what I'm asking?
So it's education and awareness. And my favorite thing to do besides treat PTSD is to stand up and run peer support programs. And peer support, boots on the ground, ears to the train tracks, right? Of what's going on when people start to change their behaviors, when a sergeant notices or a peer support person notices or an officer notices and talks to peer support and says, hey, this person is behaving differently. Everybody kind of has their baseline, their sense of humor and their coping and, their tardiness and lack thereof and, all those things, right? So we look at changes in people's behaviors as maybe sort of that early distant warning that this is an indicator something's changing. And we have those conversations. And I train peer support teams to have those conversations like, hey, this is different. What's going on these days? And having those hard conversations. To me, that's where it starts. And then, officers holding each other accountable. Hey, brother, what's going on with you? Why aren't you going, 10-7 with us? Why are you so distant? What's going on? And really like changing the culture so that people look out for each other, but not just in a, hey, you okay kind of way, like, no, really what's going on? No, really what's going on, because you're full of shit. You tell me you're fine, but I see you changing, right?
Like calling your shit out.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And honestly, that is the most honest discussion most officers will ever have, is with a fellow officer who really cares enough to be like, no, I'm calling bullshit. I'm throwing the flag. You have changed, and I see this, and I have been through stuff too, and I see some of the things that I've done in the past, and I see you doing it now. So let's have this conversation.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's true. So going back to the PTSD, something that I think, some of our listeners may or may not feel, or, I've wondered at times is, it's just a military thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's because we hear it and rightfully so, right? I mean,
right.
I'm not overseas in Iraq seeing come on. But this idea of like, well, officers can't have PTSD, and what signs to look for. Because I think there's a lot of officers that truly just don't know what signs to look for. They've just been living, right? Yeah. Like it's their norm.
Right.
And what they don't know is anything other than that. So that's actually not normal, right?
Right.
So yeah, if you can speak to that.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So, so with trauma, if the big red flags are if you're in a situation where you think you may lose your life, even for a split second, right? Or witness the loss of life of someone you care about, or witness, carnage or destruction to children, those kinds of things. Those are the big red flags. And so what happens is, like I told you, what you see here, taste, touch, and smell at the time of the trauma gets basically trapped in your frontal lobe. And you replay pretty hardcore for the first few days. And I talked about fading previously. So when it fades to your long-term memory, it's called post-traumatic stress syndrome. And post-traumatic stress syndrome is normal. And that by definition, you don't have to get help for that. But I always tell people, if there's any concern, like let's not wait around to see if it's syndrome or disorder. Let's nip it in the bud. And then over time, what happens is when it stays locked up in your frontal lobe, what happens is it unfortunately realigns your limbic system. And your limbic system is your fight or flight mechanism. It's your emotional regulation side of the house. It's your anger management center. And so here's what happens. This is the physiology of PTSD. What you see here, taste, touch, and smell stays in your frontal lobe. And you relive it over and over and over again. I refer to those as flashbangs because they're really, really unpleasant, right? You have these flashbangs, whether it's at night in your nightmares or during the day, certain triggers, and you relive it constantly. And what's happening is your brain and your body are very connected. So your body responds in kind with these fight or flight responses, even when you don't need them. In that fight or flight response, you produce cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And what we figured out is that, and we figured this out from our Vietnam veterans, is that the cortisol eventually will get so high, it'll cross the blood-brain barrier in your brain. So in order to not go toxic, it crosses the blood-brain barrier and it hits this thing called your hippocampus. And your hippocampus helps you manage trauma and loss. So when it hits your hippocampus, it causes it to shrink. And then when it shrinks, it then maligns your amygdala, which is your caveman. And it sends you into these constant triggered fight or flight responses all the time. So officers exposed to carnage, trauma, life-threatening events, or potentially life-threatening event to your partner or someone you care about, right? What happens is if it stays stuck in the frontal lobe and this basically transgresses to PTSD, what then happens is that your entire limbic system is constantly existing in the ready. You're always on edge. So, and I explain this to officers. Let's say you guys are doored up and you're just kind of shooting the shit for a while and you're in a parking lot next to a busy road and a car backfires. So a healthy amygdala, that's your caveman, that's the thing that tells you to kill and run. That thing will be like, oh, what was that, right? And everybody kind of looks over and you see it was like a piece of shit car that backfired, right? So your healthy amygdala goes, hey, what was that? And then it goes back to just in the ready. What happens to someone who has PTSD is their amygdala goes, what was that? And then it'll tell that officer for the next 4 hours, we are not safe. You need to go kill it. You need to get the hell out of here. You need to fight. You need to run. You need to kill. You need to get out. Why are you just sitting here? Why are you trying to take calls? It's time to go. It's time to go. And so it sends you into this like triggered fight or flight state for however many hours it decides to do this to you. And the officer, you'll see it. Like if you're doored up with someone and that scenario happens, you'll see their hands start to shake. Right. And then all of a sudden they're like, hey, yeah, I'm going to go take some calls, or I'm going to go set up on that bad intersection over there. And meanwhile, what they really do is they go to the church parking lot and they avoid calls for the next however many hours. And they only respond when they have to. And everything changes, like their proactivity changes and their mood changes, and they're snippy with the dispatchers, and you know how that goes, the war that happens, right? And the back and forth. Yeah. And so, and all of a sudden, like everything has changed. The shift started out fine, but then all of a sudden, no. And so this is the misery of PTSD. This is why we don't want people living with this. So what we look for is you have intrusion, arousal, and avoidance. So those intrusive images, those flashbangs, those fight or flight responses. It is normal when you drive through an intersection to be like, oh, that was the really bad wreck that I worked. But that's a good, healthy memory, right? But what we don't want is you're driving through the intersection, your heart's racing, your adrenaline's pumping, you're in full-blown fight or flight because of the wreck that you worked 6 months ago or 2 years ago or whatever it was, right? So you have those images, that the flashbangs, the arousal, which is the fight or flight responses, even when you don't need them. And then, of course, all the time and energy we spend trying to stuff it and forget about it, which is the avoidance. And that's where officers are like just trying to hold their own and, or drink it off or, or just find really maladaptive ways to get it to stop, which of course doesn't work. And so this is miserable, and we want no one to live with this.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I've heard about it throughout my career, PTSD and law enforcement. But I will say, I feel like in the last few years, probably 5 years, it's becoming more and more talked about, which is good, right? I mean, that's something we want. I think that's a positive movement, a positive momentum is talking about that. I just think that I've sat with guys that are going, well, I think people, it's just a cop out, and I hate that,
Yeah, I do too. Because people are suffering, and it's awful, and no one wants to live with this.
I think like one of the things is like people go, what happened 50 years ago, 40 years ago?
Uh-huh.
And well, me personally, I'm looking at, well, they don't deal with the same stuff we're dealing with today.
Right.
Number one.
Yes.
Number two, I think it's existed.
Yes, it did. Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. So our World War II veterans, the beauty of their process is that they came home on a ship. And in the 6 weeks of floating home on a boat, guess what happened? They outbriefed, they debriefed each other, they talked, they had that time to share, right? Officers go from patrol to home, right? They go from body recovery to home. They go from whatever, and our military members, now we fly them home. And so within 36 hours, you're in your living room sitting around going, oh my, what the hell just happened, right? One thing I want to say though, especially for the officers who are like, that this is bullshit, or this is, you're weak if you can't handle this. And every officer who comes in says, Tanya, I didn't storm through Fallujah. I didn't invade Iraq. And let me tell you what my veterans say. At least I only had to do it for 18 months.
Yeah.
Cops have to do it for 30 years.
I've literally gotten arguments. Look, I didn't serve in the military. My family, my biggest regret in my life. Like to this day, there's been conversations up until 2 years ago. I was like, I'm going right now. And I've had some knockdown, drag out arguments with individuals that go, well, what I saw, what I did. And sometimes in the people that aren't law enforcement that served, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, but dude, like, what have you been doing the last 5? Well, I've been selling taxes. Uh-huh. And how long did you do that? I did that for about 6 months. Well, we've been seeing this for 10 years.
Yeah.
Constantly. Like, it's not the same. And I hate to, and I don't know how to pose the argument to that person and go like, dude, I can't imagine what you went through. Like, no way. Like, I don't know if I could go through what you went through. But you may not have been able to go through what we see on a daily basis.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's interesting to bring that, because I think there's a lot of argument, like a lot of people have that arguments. Uh-huh. And I'm not saying one person's wrong. I'm not saying I'm right. But that's talked about a lot in the squad car. That whole,
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
And put it this way, we had some guys, we were doing some training with some special forces group a couple of years back, and we were doing some fake raids or whatever you want to call it at nighttime. And so we were their actors. And so they put us in the room, they held us up at gunpoint, and then, they put us in their headquarters area where where the terrorists are going to take us back, and sitting there with one of this guy, and the guy's like an 18-year-old, 19-year-old guy in the pipeline. And he's like, so what are you doing? I was like, well, I do such and such, for this agency, and I just hunt the baddest of the baddest dudes. And he's like, that is the coolest thing I've ever seen on the earth. And I'm like, you just landed here in a Black Hawk helicopter. You're in, and I'm like, and so I do think there's something there, right? That, and so speak on that, on how you get that through people to understand that.
You know what I explain to them all the time? Trauma is trauma. Trauma is trauma. The bottom line is it's trauma, and it sticks in.
That's so simple.
It is. It sticks in your frontal lobe the same way. The physiology of the process is exactly the same. It sticks here, and your brain can't move it, and it causes a lot of problems. So trauma is trauma. And and especially, and I do tell officers and veterans when they're like, well, I only had to do it for 18 months. And I'm like, yeah, the cops are like, well, at least I didn't have to storm through Fallujah. So there's mutual respect about this,
exactly,
right? It
exactly.
is. Absolutely.
Yeah. It sounds so simple when you just go, it's just trauma. The thing that's interesting is like identifying that trauma. Like I'm sitting here thinking about, like, there's calls that I'm like, I just will never be able to forget. Uh-huh. Right. Anything with kid, like losing a kid in my arms and having them die, like that was my first year, I guess. Those things you don't forget. And it's like, how do I find out if that, like, if I'm in that situation, right? And I'm that officer. How do I then know that that's trauma and that I need help? I know you kind of gave some stuff a little bit ago and the triggers and everything like that. But what if it's multiple different types of things that then lead you to, okay, I'm having issues now. Like, what if it's not just that one moment where I get shot? You
bet.
know, it's multiple things throughout your career, and that the flags you need to see early on. And that goes for people that aren't in law enforcement, like seeing things multiple times that then they need help, right?
Right. Yeah. So in public safety, you know, obviously the majority of our clients have cumulative traumas, right? And so it's usually when you realize, okay, my life is being impacted. Nothing is the same. You know, I've been through whatever it is, whether it's finances or a divorce or, you know, all those horrible things that just challenge us in life. And you know that you're not the same, and you know that your personality has changed, and you know that you have all these calls, right? What we do is we're going to EMDR those. And so, or my favorite thing is, what I really love, is when officers come in like in the last couple of years of their career, and we have time to EMDR that stuff so that that way they don't retire and die. And what we do is we just pick, I'd be like, hey, so tell me what's the worst thing that sticks out the most? What's the thing you relive the most? And if you have 5, I'm going to be like, okay, just pick one of the 5 and we'll do EMDR. We'll start there. Your brain has a mental map of where it knows it wants to go in order to heal, and it's going to take you there. And so it will hit everything that you need to, right? So in other words, we're going to start with the big nasties, but it's going to go, and people say all the time in EMDR that calls came up that they hadn't even thought about in years, right? But the brain is like, and while we're up here cleaning house, I'm going to process everything, and it dumps everything.
So let me ask you this, because you said something, and I've wondered this, like somebody loses their why, right?
Yeah.
And for a lot of us in law enforcement, our why is, I would hope, I know that there's a lot nowadays that it's not their calling, and some people just want the power of the badge, right? But if this is truly your why,
right,
and this is all you know, your identity for 25 years, there is this, we've seen it, this science, I guess you would say, pseudoscience of like 2 years after they're dead.
right,
You know, they're dead 6 months after, 3 months after, because this is all they did.
right.
Why is that?
So yeah, when people are retiring, I'm all over that. I'm like, so what are your plans? And they're like, oh, I'm going fishing. No, what else? Because you're not just going fishing, because after a couple of weeks of fishing, you're going to need something else. So here's the thing. Most people in public safety, police, fire, EMS, you guys, it's a calling. It's part of who you are. I mean, look at the profile of the kiddos who come into the field, right? They've been Boy Scouts, or they've been the high school, their team lead on the football team, or whatever whatever it is. There's a desire to help. There's a desire, and you guys come in with this very strong drive to right the wrongs, to protect the public, to save human beings' lives, to save property when you can. Your altruistic gene you were born with. And you guys, by the time you're coming out of high school, you have, at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is this thing called self-actualization, which is paying it forward. So you live lives of purpose and meaning. You have mission, you have goals, you have desire, you have altruism, which is the selfless giving of yourself to others. And then you enter this field and you do it forever. And some days are great and some days are horrible. And you learn how to balance all that stuff. And then you retire, and away goes your schedule, your distractions, your camaraderie, your shift mates, your purpose, your meaning. And what I always tell people approaching retirement is, yes, go fishing, but what else? What else? You have to have purpose and meaning. Sometimes purpose and meaning is raising your grandkids or traveling the world. Sometimes it's, and I really kind of push these things, like maybe you should get involved with NCMEC and take a case once in a while and find a kidnapped kid, find a kid who's being sex trafficked.
That
right?
can be done.
And that, yes.
Yeah, that's a very good program.
Right. It's beautiful. And
Yeah.
they get retired Leos all the time.
Yeah.
The beauty is that you can take a case when you have time, but if you're going to go to Europe for 6
Yep.
months, you don't, right?
Yeah.
Or find what that is, right? And figure out what that is. There's actually a lot of retired public safety folks who are now flight attendants for Southwest Airlines.
Yeah, no.
Because
Not this guy. Not this guy.
And they go travel and they go do. And honestly, the 22-year-old flight attendants are like, oh my God, this job is so stressful. I mean, well, your retired cop is like,
yeah.
I pass out drinks and I pass out pretzels and we're good. And so, yeah, but it is good to have to have that purpose and meaning, to come out of your world ready to take on what's next. I did have a police chief who came in a year before he retired, did EMDR, got it all. He had really, really bad traumas from like his first rookie year was horrible, and that on, you know. And so, and he's like, Tanya, I am going to be a civilian. I'm going to. So during his time of seeing me, he started to grow his hair out. I do air quotes, grow his hair out, because he's like, look how long my hair is. It was still very short, but you know, it was like, you know, and he stopped carrying his weapon all the time. And I was like, wow. And he's like, I am going to be a normal person. I am not going to retire and die. And he's doing great. I'm beautiful. Like he actually contributed to one of my books.
Is it science that, like, is there literally something that, or is it just what we've heard? Because I feel like, I mean, I've known some people that we've retired and died, but I mean, is it science? Are we losing a lot of people once they retire and they die?
Absolutely. So you retire and you don't have purpose and meaning and a mission. And so what happens is, if you haven't dealt with your mental health and you retire, you've lost all the distractions. And what does your brain do? It's like, oh, now that you have all this time, I'm going to hand you every shitty call you've ever dealt with, and you're going to relive it in your nightmares or during the day. And people say all the time, you hear this, like when I had an officer who's out on a shoulder injury, and it was like a 3-month, like, you know, you're out on a shoulder injury, he's out, right? And all the bad calls came just running around, cropping up in his head, running around like demons in his mind. And he's like, what is this? And I said, oh, we need to EMDR all this, especially while you're on light duty and you have time. And I said, but this is why cops retire and die. It's because when you have no distraction and purpose and meaning, what happens is it all starts to run around in your head. And of course, an officer without the camaraderie and the support and what am I going to do? What do? They start drinking. So not only do you have the trauma running around in your head, but you're now drinking, trying to drink it off, trying to get it to stop. And you're miserable, and you can't reach out to your buddies because how do you explain this? And so it's awful. So yes, that's exactly why. And it's awful. I hate to see that. I want you guys to go milk those pensions for as long as you can, because you deserve it. You've earned it.
Yeah.
Like, go live, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's you know, I've always heard that. I've seen it. You know, I've seen it a few times. It's like, man, I see, like, there's guys I see in my head right now, just the old dudes. And I'm like, been in law enforcement how many years? 52 years. And you just worry, like, you're just like, man, I mean, you're going to retire here. What? Just like, yeah. And the next thing you know, you're like, you died of a heart attack or something like that. And I'm like, why is it, you know, it just seems to work out that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. The what? Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah. The what? Okay. I think my she's very interested in the conversation too, so she's wanted to ask you questions too. But I can't really hear anything because. But anyways, so you know, we talk about the PTSD, and that's kind of where you've lived and in your studies, right, and what you've dedicated your career to. You talk about these programs that you can do for agencies and everything. How does somebody even come about getting involved with you to like have them even come in? I'm not just talking about the individual, because that seems pretty explanatory. Google you, come get help. But an agency that wants this as a resource, like, what do they do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work with agencies to set up programs. So they just reach out and do that. Honestly, I've put everything I've ever done, I've put in my books. So I've got 6 out, a 7th one coming. And it is, you know, everything on how I set up my very first program, which was Austin Travis County EMS, which honestly I did for free for 3 years just to prove that they needed it. And then, so it started to sort of build. And I at the time I got the EMS contract, I thought that'll be my only agency. But then a fire department's like, hey, what do you have going on there and all that? So I've put it in my books. I just released a book on peer support from start to finish, sample policies, how to recruit, how to train. That's awesome. Yeah, my curriculum's in there. Like, I don't know. You
don't have to think about it.
Yeah, just do it. Here it is. Just do it, right? And so, so agencies frequently, you know, reach out. Currently, I'm working with Cobb County, Georgia, on setting up their program and vetting therapists out there to kind of. I'll stay as long as needed, but you know, obviously, eventually to hand it off to some therapists out there. And so really it's in my books, and I'm happy to consult or come jump in for a while until we get your program up and running, and then step out.
That's awesome. So has it evolved? Like, has the way, obviously science evolves, because I mean, a lot of this is very scientific, way over my head, you know, I just criminology degree, but, has the human evolved to where the officer, the first responder evolved so much where you have to treat differently. You understand what I'm asking?
Oh, yes.
You know, like I'm curious to see, like, or just are we been in humans? We've always been humans, and we know more now.
Well, what has really evolved? Oh, so the field of mental health for first responders is evolving. First responders have evolved. Honestly, officers have so much more equipment, and they have way more steps in the use of force. And
I want you to use your 29 years because I'm curious, because that's a good reference point, especially for like me. Like, you know, in 29 years, I mean, that's a long time, but it's not 200 years. You know?
Yeah. It has changed. Everything is on film now. Everything, whether it's your camera or everybody else's camera filming you. Paramedics have more drugs, more options, more responsibilities, advanced techniques like this. So as things have evolved, the stress level on you guys has evolved. The decision making is way more convoluted. It is really, and so that's another thing. It's such an interesting question, because if you want to look at everything else on top of the trauma, it's the fact that everything's videotaped. Everything, your responsibilities are far greater. The options you have in front of you are far greater. You know, when I went through the academy, tasers didn't exist, and shotguns versus rifles. And so, but that's one more thing we've added to your plate, right? And one more step to take. And so I think that it has, the complexity of the work has absolutely increased. Has
it made your job harder or easier?
Honestly, I don't think it's made my job harder, because treating trauma, we have evolved in our tools, and the tools have made my job easier in terms of treating trauma. I think that the biggest, most important thing is the understanding the terminology and getting, so, you know, when tasers came out, I went and watched taser class so I could understand what the officers, what they were being told and where it was being located in their, you know, on their, and with all their equipment, and, you know, how that all went. I didn't volunteer to get tasered. No, thank you. No.
We can gladly set that up.
My biggest fear is that I'd pee on myself. So, no. But I did attend a taser class with one of my departments just to see what they were doing. Right. And so I think that has made, you know, our challenges. And when I hire somebody new and they know nothing about law enforcement, you know, the best way to do that is, for the first 6 months when we're not dealing with a virus, is to have them go ride along. And I pay them to go ride along. Like, the first 6 months, go ride, police, fire, EMS, go ride, get up in communications, get under a headset, go ride along, go understand this. Ask the firefighters to take you out into the bay and show you every piece of equipment.
Besides the kitchen.
What does what? Yeah. And absolutely, yes. Get in that patrol car and ask the officer, what does that do? What is that button? You know, can I push the button? No. Yeah. You know, but to get as much knowledge as they can. And that's the drinking from the fire hose in our practice, is getting people caught up to that stuff.
That's interesting to, you know, that you say that. You know, it's good to know that medicine's keeping up with that, right? Because, I mean, this is a medical field, right? You know, like, y'all look at it as a very scientific approach, and it's interesting because I look at it as very non-scientific.
Yeah.
You know? And I think that's probably a lot of the issue is I think a lot of the misunderstanding that happens within mental health is that people don't understand the science of it.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
That... like what you're talking about with the brain and the amygdala and all that. And some stuff you just can't control, right? And so we've always been humans, but science is evolving as officers are evolving.
Absolutely.
And it sounds like y'all are able to keep up a lot faster than we're able to, you know, admit we've got the issue.
We try.
Yeah. So where can people find you? It's a big one. And then I've got a couple other questions. But where can people find you? But in your books and everything, obviously we post some stuff about your books and all that. But I want people to know that as a resource and an easy resource for them to go to.
Absolutely. So my website is www.tania, Tania is weird spelling, Glenn with 2 N's. And all of the books are on Amazon or barnesandnoble.com, wherever books are sold. So those are all available. And I have a book up there for Leo's kids. It's called Protected But Scared. I wrote it after Ferguson. And that's been a hot seller this year, unfortunately, after everything that happened with the riots. But then I have another book coming out. My 7th book will be coming out probably in about a month. And that ties in a military member's kid and a firefighter's kid and a flight medic's kid. So I kind of branched out to the rest of public safety. It was really cute. There's a firefighter who told me that his kid was freaking out when he went to work because of COVID. And he's like, I'm just going to get protected but scared, and I'm going to change police officer to firefighter. And I was like, okay, now I need to write another kid's book. So,
That's cool.
My friends are really impressed that I wrote two kids' book without the word fuck. So,
Yeah.
I do have an editor though,
Oh,
and she's fabulous.
No, that's good. Yeah. And so people can find your books on your website. Where else can they find them?
Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Yeah. The link on my website will take you straight to Amazon. So yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So got a couple more questions for you, but as we wrap up, so the idea of the warrior, right? You know, we hear the warrior's ethos and, you know, Lieutenant Grossman's books, you know, stuff on, you know, sheepdog and all this stuff and the warrior concept. I'm a believer in it.
I am too.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know if you were or weren't, because there's a lot of agencies that are trying to get rid of that warrior ethos and that warrior mindset. And they want us to be more of the gatekeeper, right? Which there's a time and place.
Right.
We had a great episode with Greg Amundsen. Thank you very much. You know, talking about how, you know, his belief was the warrior's the warrior and the gatekeeper's the gatekeeper. Positive or negative? Answer that first.
Positive.
Positive. Okay. Why do you think that's under attack? And do you think that's a negative thing for that concept of the warrior to be under attack mentally for law enforcement or first responders?
So here's the thing. There's always the really, really evil doer out there. There are absolute horrible people, sociopaths. They work out every day. They're strong. They're mean. They don't give a shit if they kill a cop. If you don't have a warrior mindset going into that, the chance of failure, in my opinion, is so high. The fact that the warrior ethos, the warrior mindset is under attack, I think is from civilians who don't understand, and the pressure put on by, I understand some cops standing there with their resting bitch face, they look mean and they seem mean and they bark at you and they're rude and maybe they hurt your feelings. Honestly, okay, whatever, right? Knowing who is out there and knowing what is out there. We're in Texas. We have MS-13 at our border, crossing our border. And MS-13 doesn't give a shit if they kill as many people as they need to. So it takes a warrior to go meet them where they are and to take care of business. And I there's a time and a place for everything, right? You can't have a softer, kinder police force and think that they're going to be able to stomp out crime and go get the bad people. And the bad people are plenty. So to me, it's very alarming. I don't think you should dismantle the warrior mindset. I think what we do is we make it stronger. We work out harder. We give you better tools. We give you the confidence and the competence to go into any situation and come out successfully. That's my philosophy.
Do you think that, answer this. Can a warrior have mental health problems?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Easy. I agree with that. Do you think there's this, why is there this conflict that the warrior can't have the mental health, that the warrior shouldn't seek help, right? Because I think a lot of times we think that people are putting out this stigma that if we get rid of this whole mindset of I'm this Billy the Bad, that's not what we're saying. The warrior, right? That, will make them more softer and more caring and more gentle to be able to then welcome the help, right? So how are we combating that to where allowing the warriors to be the warriors, but be okay with saying, I need help? Because to me, that makes you more a warrior.
Right.
If you're willing to go,
you're more resilient.
I'm going to break down your door and I'll take those bullets for this next door neighbor, but I may need help with that, right? How do you handle that mindset for the person coming in here that doesn't want to lose that I'm a warrior? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of my departments, I started after a horrible SWAT line of duty death. And the commander called. After a month, he said they were quote unquote unraveling, and he's like, "We need your help." And I said, "Okay, here's what I'm going to do first. I'm going to educate. They're not going to talk to me. I have zero credibility, so I'm going to educate them. So let me do a brief for them." And so we set up in their normal classroom, and I went in. I have my therapy dog with me. They're sitting all in the back, arms crossed, pissed off, won't look at me. My dog is working the crowd and they're like, and they're staring at me and they're petting my dog. And my dog's like, right. I'm like, I've got you. I've got you. So I start this presentation and I start with fight or flight, adrenaline, glucose, cortisol. I talk about acute stress. I talk about delayed stress. I talk about cumulative stress. I talk about PTSD, what it is. I talk about options. I talk about resilience. I talk about strength. I talk about all the things without the word feelings in there. And I kid you not, they're starting like this. And within 10 minutes, their arms are down. And by 20 minutes in, like they're resting with, and this team, and this is what I do everywhere I go, every agency I work with, I educate first. This team lined up afterwards to talk to me. The commander was like, holy crap, what did you do? And I was like, I just educated them. Right. So this team, here's the crux, right? Here's the point where I've got them. Is they're like, hey, so, there's this one officer who was injured in this event. He's not back at work yet. Can we go to his house and see him? Absolutely, yes. And they're like, hey, well, we've got training tomorrow. Can you come out and can you come to our yes, SWAT hallowed ground, your training center? Yes. Yeah. So meanwhile, I've got patients, but they understand I can move them to the next day, and just kind of juggle them around. So I go out there the next day to the SWAT hallowed ground of their training. And they're talking about, hey, we're going to work, barricaded subjects and who wants to play the victim? Who wants to be the victim? And I was like, I'll be your victim. And they're like, what? I'm like, yeah. I was like, do you want like Stockholm syndrome or do you want pissed off because you took too long? Like, what do you want? And they're like, I don't know. And I was like, okay, I'm going to give you something different every time. And from there, like, guess what? There's no stopping any of us. I EMDR'd every single member of that team, right? And then 9 months later, they have a second SWAT line of duty death. Lightning strikes twice. And by then I'm already in. So I'm there that day with them. I'm at the hospital with them. Then we're at the funeral and we're doing basically, and that's how I get into the heart and the mind of the warrior is I educate and I normalize and I offer solutions. The first person who does EMDR every time. First, same thing with this team. The first person who did EMDR was like, wow. And he went and told everybody else, this is awesome. You're a fool if you don't go do this. And so they're like, hey, I'll do this every time. I walk into people's worst days and their worst crises. And the first thing I do is I educate and I normalize and I talk about solutions, right? I might throw in there a thing or two about being at, ground zero after 9/11 with NYPD for 4 weeks. And I might talk about Katrina and the shit show that was. I might throw in the fact that I'm married to a cop. Whatever works, whatever grabs them in terms of credibility. That's how we do it.
Yeah. And I probably should have done a better job allowing you to give credibility before the show, but really I put it in the post like, I couldn't write as much. Like, I literally I could talk at the beginning of this episode. It would just be me running my mouth and stuff. And that's why, I wanted to reach out to you because, this is something that's near and dear to me. And I think it's near and dear to a lot of officers, but they don't want to admit it's near and dear to them.
Yeah.
And so, and I think there's a lot of people that just want that help, that they don't know how to get that help. And my thing is like what I said, if we can reach one person and stop them from pulling the trigger or whatever on their self, today, mission accomplished. I could shut down the show and everything would be accomplished.
Absolutely.
So for that person that may be listening right now that needs help in that moment of crisis, what do they do?
So look at your local resources, right? And look at, do you have a peer support team that you can trust? Do you have local clinicians? Has anybody ever mentioned going to therapy with a therapist that they thought was pretty cool? Like look around first, reach out to Copline, reach out, to the National Suicide Hotline, whatever your comfort level is. If you're a texter, they have texting options. If you want to just call and be anonymous, you can do that. If you want to find local resources, you can do that. If you want to reach out to me, you absolutely can. Obviously, my reach is, Arizona and Texas. So I can't go everywhere and be everywhere, but certainly I can try to vet some local therapists for you or help you find one. But yeah, just please reach out, please.
But it's expensive.
Well, so it depends, right?
So that's that. And I say that because I know I've had people say it's too expensive. Like I can't afford to do it. Like, what do you do?
Yeah. Well, if you have health insurance, you use your health insurance. I typically with people who are in high distress, I don't recommend the EAP because you're going to run out of sessions, but go through your United or your Blue Cross Blue Shield. Like, let's find you a therapist who takes your insurance and just do the copay. Right. And so, more and more, there are resources across the country that we can figure out and make happen for people.
Yeah. people are running out of excuses.
Yes.
You know, and that's the thing now. There's so much out there that you don't really have the excuse to say that, or that cop out of like, hey, you know, it's just too expensive or whatever it is. There's something out there, right? Okay, so our last question, and then we'll wrap things up. This is a question we ask everybody, but I'm curious to see how this correlates to you and your beliefs and everything. You know, we started the show because we wanted to highlight uncommon people, right? People that are within their field, within their lives, they live uncommon lives, like such as yourself, that sacrifice so much for the first responders. You know, that's uncommon in and of itself. You know, in a world of commonality, of so much commonness, so much bleakness, so much just blah. What do you believe being uncommon means? Like, what does that mean to you?
I think, to me, being uncommon means like following your passion and caring for others. I think that I had, and I wrote about this in one of my books. I was a University of Texas freshman, and I needed a physical to go to school to do sports. And I found this doctor, it was my dad's doctor. He's 65 years old, right? Dr. Cromer. I had nothing in common with him. He was uncommon. He would sit down with me the first time, shut the door, nurse in there. She's like, "You're running late." He's like, "I know, I don't care." And he spent 45 minutes with me talking about everything that could possibly go wrong as a University of Texas freshman. He talked about date rape and Rohypnol and, you know, frat parties and alcohol and passing out and all that stuff, right? And I'm sitting there like in shock. And the more he talked to me, the more I realized that he was like, he cared. He was an ally. Yeah. And every time I went to see him, it was 45 minutes. How's your life? Now you're a sophomore. What's going on here? What about this? You know? And he taught me how to be a better provider. I modeled my practice after that. So to me, being uncommon means really, really giving a shit and really meeting our customers where they are on their worst days, in their darkest moments. You know, the biggest call outs are Christmas Eve and Super Bowl Sunday, of course. And just knowing that it doesn't matter, because what matters most is living your life in the service to others.
That's awesome. That's awesome. No, I really appreciate letting us come down here and talk to you. I could literally go on for hours. I got so many other questions and stuff, because I mean, it's a hot button issue. You know, it's been something that I think we're seeing more and more talking about. You know, we're fixing to start a series with Operation Enduring Warrior. And it's going to be called, you know, they've named the series, and part of the series, A Warrior's Voice. And it's these wounded warriors, these police officers that have been injured in the line of duty. And they don't really want to go tell their story on TV or in front of other people. And so we want to give them a place where they feel comfortable to tell their story. And I'm so glad we did this episode before, because it gives me understanding of some of the way that things work, to be able to sit across these people that have gone through, like, there's clear trauma, right?
Absolutely.
There's no ifs, ands, or buts. I mean, like, there's no guessing that's trauma. You've been shot, it's trauma. You've been blown up, that's trauma. Right. And I just hope people utilize you as a resource and really go and research this more, because I think it's something in our nation. It's a crisis, and it needs to be addressed more. And I'm thankful that you're doing what you're doing and killing it.
Thank you.
Yeah, killing it. So,
thank you for having me. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you. So last place, where can people go to find you again? Just drop it again.
www.taniaglenn.com.
And you're on Instagram and Facebook?
I am. Absolutely.
What is the usernames?
So at Tania Glenn for Facebook, and at Dr. Tania Glenn and Associates. That's my company. It's all work anyway. And then Instagram is at Tania Glenn.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, make sure you go check her out. Make sure you go follow her. Go buy some of the books. And please, you don't want to reach out to her. You want to shoot us a message, going through something, you don't know how to go through it. I'm not saying I have the answers, because I can almost guarantee you I don't. And probably what I'm going to do is go to her for reference. But hey, all it is just asking for help. Just ask for the help in the moment, whatever that may be. Reach out to us. And remember what I always say, stay safe, stay switched on, and stay uncommon.